All right. Just one brief request for you all. Please follow us on social media. Um, Also, please sign up for our newsletter. It'll be switching soon from monthly to weekly as the legislative sessions in both states start to ramp up. So appreciate you all doing that and for you being here today. So just quick context, who we are, why we care about these things. Um, Ultimately, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that brings together business and education voices around practical policy that improves student outcomes. We focus on evidence, execution, and clear communication of those things. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We amplify the business voice to help support policies and practices that make sure that more students in Kansas and Missouri succeed from early grades through the workforce. In our minds, literacy is a gateway skill. So here's how we'll briefly spend our time together. We'll start with why literacy now, grounding that in the data, summarizing what evidence says to us, and then walking through the prevention, intervention, and retention framework, highlighting the state policies that exist in Kansas and Missouri today, and close with what's working and what's stuck. And like I said, with a brief period of question and answers, and also just to hear from you all, your comments, your feedback as to what we've talked about today. So let's begin with the why. Reading in grades 3 and 4 sets the trajectory for everything that follows. And over the last decade, national results have dipped and then stalled. The bounce back has not arrived. We know that policies matter, but execution, the actual minutes delivered in classrooms, progress checks, and aligned materials and coaching is what ultimately moves outcomes. Quite simply, we can't afford to ignore the elephant in the room anymore. Too many of our students are not reading up to our state and national standards. So to frame the problem, I'm going to start with the national picture and then quickly move on to Kansas and Missouri. So just looking at the national picture, it's good to look at the National Assessment of Education Progress Results, or NAEP. It's a national yardstick for student achievement. It's run by a federal statistics agency. It samples schools and students so we can see what systems are doing and how they're doing, and not judge individual kids or teachers. Every state takes the same tests, samples students, which is why NAEP is useful for comparing trends. Scores are on a 0 to 500 scale, and it's grouped by achievement levels: below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. One key caveat: NAEP proficient is purposely a high bar. It doesn't equal a state's on-grade level label. For this webinar, we're focused on grade 4 reading over the last decade, 2017, 19, and 2022, and now recently 2024 results. Looking at the slide, you can kind of see three inflection points, in my opinion. A softening that occurs in 2019, a step down in 2022, and a flat line in 2024. The key takeaway isn't any single data point. It's the shape, the dip, and then the plateau. That plateau matters because grade 4 reading is the hinge from students learning to read in their classrooms to reading to learn. If we don't see movement here, we should expect stress in later grades, slower access to content, and widening gaps. Two quick guardrails for interpreting any kind of NAEP data. First, NAEP is a consistent national bar. That's why we use it to frame this trend. Second, many of the 2022 to 2024 changes are not yet statistically significant. We're still waiting on final results, so the 2024 is still preliminary. But it ultimately reinforces the idea that it's a stall and not a rebound that we're seeing. Now let's place Kansas and Missouri on the same national yardstick. So both states, as you can see, mirror the national pattern. Over this period, slippage in 2019, a clear drop in 2022, and no real movement in 2024. That's really the core message. At a state level, we're not seeing the recovery. I am deliberately not comparing state test labels to NAEP bar here. NAEP is a higher, more consistent benchmark, but it's useful to look at where states are on that benchmark. What matters for our story is how both states sit, and the same post-2019 plateau as the nation remains true. This is kind of the context for everything that follows. But let's take a look at each state's own. I would kindly ask people to please mute themselves to avoid echoing. Thank you. I want to look at state's own assessment data to see the local picture.
I feel like you telling me this.
So state ELA assessments are different. They're built by each state and match state standards, and almost every student takes them each year. That makes them powerful because we're seeing change within states and across districts. But proficiency labels and cut scores are state set. So for the time being, I'm just using the NAEP proficiency labels here for both states. I know they're different. As you can see, Kansas offers longer public trend series, which will help us see multi-year trends. And as you will see in a few slides, Missouri's publicly reported data is actually a shorter time window, often about 3 years at a time, which limits how far back we can show a consistent line. Put simply, NAEP tells the national story with the common bar. State tests tell the local story against state expectations. Here, Kansas is at grade 3 level data, the first statewide checkpoint often where we can see the influence of reading instruction really show up. Over the last several years, the through line is pressure at grade 3. We saw a dip at 2022, and since then, little sustained movement up. In other words, the state trend mirrors the national story we saw with NAEP, a drop and a plateau rather than a rebound. Two caveats to read this correctly. First, grade 3 is highly sensitive to cohort effects, meaning that there are small changes in attendance and absences that can influence testing windows, or mobility of students can often swing results in districts. Second, any cut score or reporting updates can nudge level counts year over year. So right away, we can read this as just a multi-year shape. Kansas is not back to its pre-2019 footing in grade 3. That's the signal we can carry through for the rest of the presentation. Now let's just check out the same checkpoint for Missouri. Missouri's grade 3 picture points in the same direction, strain in the early grades and no clear statewide rebound since 2022. One important context to note is that Missouri's public trend window is shorter. Most easily comparable statewide releases give us about 3 years at a time, and student level cohorts typically start around 2022 or 2021. That limited window means that we're careful not to overclaim long-term trends, but inside that window, the pattern aligns with NAEP and with Kansas. Grade 3 reading remains stalled rather than rising. Practically, that means many students are still hitting grade 4 without secure decoding and fluency, exactly where NAEP lines have flattened. So let's jump ahead in the pipeline and look at ELA scores in high school in Kansas. At this checkpoint, Kansas looks more stable than earlier grades, but let's not confuse stability with recovery. What you're seeing here is the downstream effect. If grade 3 and 4 foundations are weak, high school lines trend flatten rather than climb because the pipeline is carrying earlier gaps forward. Two reading notes for this slide. First, high school assessments are less sensitive to year-to-year swings than grade 3s and 4s. So small bumps don't necessarily signal a turn. Second, comparability still matters. Participation in course taking patterns or standard setting changes can move the needle. Taken together, Kansas's high school English language arts suggests that no broad-based acceleration has happened yet. Missouri's high school ELA shows a similar story with the same data window caveat. Here we can see the English language arts checkpoint at high school is broadly flat in Missouri. And in the publicly available data window, it shows us that since 2022, that has remained the case. As with grade 3, this is a shorter public window, so I don't want to overinterpret a long arc, but within that recent span, we can see no sustained upward shift. Missouri's high school measure is tied to course-based testing, so in this case, English 2, which means that results can be reflected by course-taking patterns or sequencing when a student takes a course, as well as this growth in their actual skills. Pair that with a shorter trend window, and the right conclusion is modest, that high school line is holding steady, not rising, and looks consistent with what we'd expect in grades 3 and 4 reading, which has not recovered. So if grade 3 strain shows up again in high school, the question is, what are states doing about it? And the answer is quite a lot. We've seen a huge wave of literacy laws that have taken shape, and it's another reason why we're talking about literacy today. Over the last decade, state legislatures, not just school districts, have driven this shift to evidence-based reading and writing instruction. Since 2013, 40 states plus Washington, D.C. have passed laws centered on phonics. The pace has accelerated sharply. 1 or 2 states a year from 2013 to 2018, 8 in 2019, 13 states in 2021, 8 again in 2022, and a further 17 states in 2023. So most of these laws cluster around 3 basic moves: aligning teacher preparation and in-service preparation and coaching around the science of reading. 2, adopting science of reading aligned materials and phasing out guessing strategies. And 3, requiring universal K through 3 screeners with targeted interventions, often including dyslexia checks. You can see how the range, and not only how states have stitched these together, but what they are actually implementing. In Alabama, for instance, they passed a law in 2019 that paired a science of reading requirement with summer learning camps, a 3rd grade promotion bar, and funding for reading specialists in districts. Indiana's 2023 law mandated a science of reading curricula and banned 3Qing within schools, embedding their science of reading in teacher preparation courses. Ohio's 2023 law is notable in that it ended mandatory retention, but required science of reading materials, professional development, and dyslexia screening on request. And in Vermont, their 2024 law required explicit K through 3 instruction, screening, and intervention, professional learning for teachers, and updates to educator prep based on the science of reading. Massachusetts is the most recent state to join these states, actually within the last few weeks, that passed a unanimous bipartisan bill enacting some of these changes. The bottom line here is that the policy recipe is very common. We have materials for instruction, training and coaching for educators, and screening interventions for students. From here, outcomes often hinge on execution. So let's ground the what to execute in the actual evidence itself. I just want to level set on what people mean by what they say the science of reading. It's not a program, it's a large body of research about how the brain ultimately learns to read and write. The key here is the difference from older balanced literacy or 3Qing approaches, and that we're not asking kids to guess words from pictures or contexts. We teach them to code and decode words directly and systemically, and then build everything else on top of that. There are pieces of this that ultimately make up the 6 key pillars of the science of reading. The first one is phonemic awareness, which is the ear skill, the ability to hear and work with individual sounds to make words. The second is phonics, or the code, linking these sounds to actual letters on a page so that students can decode them and spell words. Fluency, or the reading that is accurate and automatic, freeing the brain to make space for meaning in a text. Vocabulary is knowing what words actually mean and how they're constructed. And ultimately, background knowledge, which are the facts and concepts that help make a passage make sense to a student. When these all come together, they help ultimately gain comprehension. They can actually understand what they're reading. What the evidence says is first that explicit systemic instruction, especially for phonemic awareness and phonics in early grades, is paired with content-rich curriculum, so students can constantly build vocabulary and knowledge. And this sticks at scale only when teachers receive ongoing training and coaching, short in-class feedback cycles that help routines become habits. That's the why and the what. Next, we'll show you how these pieces turn to day-to-day routines and what actually moved reading in classrooms. So we just named the building blocks: sounds, code, fluency, vocabulary knowledge, and reading comprehension. But here's how they actually become daily practice. First, we teach students how to code every day. In short, explicit phonics lessons plan plus decoding practice, using decodable texts early so kids only practice the patterns they've been taught, so accuracy sticks, shifting into regular books when it's time. That's how we build automaticity without guessing what actually words are. Second, building knowledge on purpose. Comprehension isn't just a generic skill. Reading content-rich text aloud, teaching vocabulary in context, and running units where kids learn real stuff like science, history, and the world. Knowledge lifts comprehension. Third, lifting fluency. Doing frequent oral reading out loud with quick feedback and short rereads. It's simple. Accuracy plus pace frees attention for students to make meaning. Fourth, using a steady rhythm. Screening all K-3 students on fixed windows and checking progress on a regular schedule, ideally every 4 to 6 weeks. That rhythm matters more than any kind of brand of screener we're using. Fifth, giving help during the school day. Small group or one-on-one defined minutes per week is shown to be the best practice. Time on task is the lever. As available, it doesn't really help move students. Sixth and finally, back it with tools and coaching, using aligned core intervention materials and pairing them with ongoing in-class coaching for educators, not just one-off workshops, and ending 3Qing as a practice, so we're not drifting into guessing, but making meaning from reading. This is the science lived in classrooms. The next slide frames these routines in one system: prevention, intervention, and a narrow guardrail for retention of students. So they work together instead of as random add-ons. So we just walked through the research and what it looks like as the science of reading in classrooms. Now we've seen states and districts begin organizing this and operationalizing this into a single framework. Over the past decade, policy has moved towards the science of reading. So as districts implement it, we see that they are implementing it along prevention, intervention, and retention. Prevention is the foundation, a strong core for every classroom, aligning their materials, daily decoding, especially in grades K through 1, and universal K through screeners with clear reporting to families as to how their students are doing. Intervention is the safety net, with the screener flags actually flag risk of a student who is falling behind or not reading at grade level. Help starts quickly and happens during the school day and comes with enough minutes in small groups. Ideally, every 4 to 6 weeks, we check progress and adjust. Retention is the guardrail, used rarely with clear criteria and exemptions, and alongside tutoring and other supports like summer school. These parts work in a loop. Strong prevention means fewer students need intervention, and tight intervention means fewer ever reach a retention decision. The regular data checks cycle back and hopefully strengthen classroom instruction. Policy gives us the structure. The framework is how it lives period to period now within schools. I want to spend some time seeing what this actually looks like. So when we say prevention, what we're actually meaning is making every single classroom strong enough so that fewer kids need to pull outs later. In practical terms, many schools are moving away from one big English language arts program plus a separate intervention program and towards a dedicated core phonics block that sits alongside its English language arts. That block teaches the code explicitly, how sounds map to letters, so most children don't learn by guessing, but learn by decoding early. When that tier 1 does its heavy lifting, fewer students fall behind, and we spend less time and money trying to catch them up down the road. Prevention also means screening students on fixed windows, usually 3 or more short checks a year. These aren't high stakes tests, they're quick measures that tell us who is on track with decoding, fluency, comprehension, and who isn't. Families ultimately get these results so they know where their child stands, and teachers tighten instruction, hopefully in short order. In grades K and 1 especially, students practice with decodable texts, books built from the letter sound patterns they've already been taught, so practice is accurate and not guess-based. As that accuracy sticks, they shift into regular books. At the same time, we don't treat comprehension as a free-floating skill. We build background knowledge and vocabulary on purpose with content-rich read-alouds and units in science, social studies, and literature, and more. Knowledge is what makes text make sense. The glue is then ultimately coaching, and a quick team huddles after each screening window for educators. A coach works within classrooms, not just a one-day workshop, and grades team using screener data to plan the next few weeks out. What to reteach, what routines to strengthen, and what needs extra minutes. The payoff is the prevention dividend ultimately. Better earlier outcomes, fewer students needing pullouts, and the ability to focus resources where they matter most. And when a screener shows that a student is off track, we don't ultimately wait. We speed up, and what matters most is we shift to a targeted intervention strategy right away. So when we say intervention, we mean that help is quick, scheduled, and measured, not when we can do it. The moment a screener flags a student, we start within weeks and put time on a master schedule, about 90 to 120 minutes a week spread across 3 to 4 short sessions. We group students in very small groups or one-on-one instructions so students read aloud and get immediate feedback. What do we teach? The essentials that actually move reading, phonemic awareness and phonics to fix the code, connected text reading and appropriate decodables or controlled texts, and ultimately help them gain fluency, accurately paced reading out loud with quick rereads to adjust. Material should match this core and avoid programs that lean on level text and guessing strategies. Every few weeks, we run brief progress checks, and if growth isn't there, we change to something new. Add minutes, shrink the group, adjust the sequence, or swap a better matched routine. For students who need more or layered supports, in-school high-frequency tutoring and structured summer learning also can help gains and make sure they don't slide. That's the through line. Accountability, minutes that are actually delivered, growth that is actually checked, and the plan actually adjusted fast. That's how intervention stops being a place kids go and becomes a set of moves that adjust and close gaps. Finally, retention refers to a rule that lets or requires schools to hold students back a grade, usually in early reading, when they don't meet a set of benchmark by year's end. Typically, this features a trigger to start a retention discussion, most commonly a score on a state test or over time what we see in screening data after supports are provided to a student. And then we outline supports that student receives before the retention is ultimately agreed to. And we provide specific exemptions for students, for instance, with disabilities or for whom English is a second language. The goal is to give more time to students who are struggling in reading and writing. Retention is the lightning rod in literacy policy. It's high stakes for families and schools, and its effects depend on how it's done and carried out. What we see in the research is that when retention is rare, criteria-based, and paired with real support, extra minutes, targeted tutoring, summer learning, etc., students can show some short-term reading gains. Those gains are largest in systems that improved K-3 instruction at the same time. The trade-offs are real. Some students experience stigma, and long-term effects are mixed on reading outcomes, especially when retention becomes common or that the added support isn't delivered. So the policy stance here is narrow, treating retention as a last resort guardrail, not the plan, used with tutoring, summer programs, and clear exemptions for students already receiving appropriate services. With that context, our emphasis remains on prevention and intervention within this framework, the everyday work that keeps students off the edge of retention. We've covered that works in classrooms. Next, we'll see how each state has translated them into policy. As we go, I want you to listen for some of the three key things that I've listened to, which are what materials are they offering, what kind of training are they providing, and how are they screening students with follow-up. And notice how each different state uses different levers. First up, Kansas. So Kansas has ultimately moved from recommendations to clear requirements. Instruction now must be evidence-based. Teachers teach the science of reading directly, and they build fluency in vocabulary and comprehension over time. Strategies that ask children to guess words from pictures or in context are not allowed in early grades as of July this year. That aligns with teacher practice and what the actual research supports. Every student in kindergarten through grade 3 through kindergarten through grades 3 is screened on a fixed statewide window with a state-approved tool. Families get those results, which matters because it prompts action and keeps everyone on the same page. If a student is flagged at risk, the school writes a reading plan and spells those things out in 5 ways: the student-specific needs, the minutes per week delivered, who is delivering that help, which materials will be used, and when progress is checked. Districts are expected to adopt core and intervention materials that align with the science of reading. Accreditation reviews now look for the alignment and for evidence of practices that are actually happening within districts. On the people side, Kansas has invested in teacher training and coaching at scale, letters and regional supports, for example, and tied early literacy competencies into teacher licensure so that new teachers and in-service teachers can be prepared and have a path forward to meeting a set standard. Finally, Kansas does not have an automatic third grade retention policy. The sequence is prevention first, timely intervention second, and only then local decision about promotion if supports are not enough. Missouri's system starts with early detection for all students. Schools run required reading screeners, including checks for characteristics of dyslexia, so struggling readers are identified quickly. When a child is off track, the school must implement what is known as a reading success plan. That plan sets goals, the weekly minutes, who is providing the help, the materials to be used, and the progress schedule checks. It is a living document and ultimately should change if growth is not happening for that student. On the materials and methods, Missouri requires elementary programs to be phonics forward and explicitly bans 3Qing. The goal is to eliminate mixed messages. Core instruction and intervention should both reflect the same evidence base. To help districts implement, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has stood up some statewide supports which provide training, on-site coaching, and help with curriculum adoption in schools so that they're not just doing it alone. Promotion still remains a local decision in Missouri. There is no automatic third grade retention requirement. That keeps focus on earlier actions, strong instruction, documented intervention, and frequent monitoring. So just here's a side-by-side as a glance to review. So I want to end today's webinar by just going over what we think is working, what we think could be better. 2 encouraging shifts are visible across Kansas and Missouri. First, we know that the materials are cleaner. Districts are adopting phonics forward and science reading backed programs, phasing out guessing strategies. Teachers have decodables for early practice. Second, capacity is growing. More teachers are getting structured literacy training and in-class coaching. Screeners are landing on schedule with cleaner family reporting. We're also seeing more minutes for intervention baked into the school day, not just after school. These are the right building blocks. The job now is to make these practices consistent school to school, district to district. And consistency is ultimately the hinge. Here's where it still kind of breaks down. Across districts, families and teachers describe very different experiences under the same policy. Help minutes vary widely. Progress checks aren't always predictable on a weekly or 4 to 6 week cadence. Some plans don't change quickly when growth stalls. We also don't publicly track the basics, minutes delivered, group size, or specific reading program in use, so it's hard to see where implementation is strong versus thin. Add to that two state level realities that both show persistent gaps in the early grades that trickle up to high school. None of this is ultimately a mystery. It's an execution problem. The fix is boring and powerful. Same windows, same cadence, scheduled minutes that actually happen. And that sets up ultimately how I want to close, that we have one system from early grades through high school. We talked a lot about policy. We talked a lot about practice and research. In closing, I think we should have a system that works as one, not a collection of projects. That means having common sense screening windows, a shared rhythm of checking progress, and divine interventions so that the fourth grader in one district gets the same promise as a fourth grader anywhere else. Second, we need to build capacity before we ultimately have compliance. Coaching in classrooms, principals leading the way, and establishing simple routines are what turn rules into habits that teachers can keep. Third, we learn fast and adjust fast. If growth isn't there for a cycle, we don't wait for a quarter to end. We add minutes, tighten groups, or switch approaches. That keeps students from drifting. And finally, we can serve our students. How can we serve our later students? Ultimately, is what I want to know. Earlier grades are getting a lot of attention and focus in this discussion and other discussions around literacy, but I worry middles and high schools are getting short shrift. We need a version of this that fits their day as well. And that's where I ultimately see the next frontier of policy and practice taking shape, with the lessons informed by the ongoing work in the early grades. So after a ton of information, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop recording, and so that we can all come back together and ultimately answer any questions you may have or hear any of your feedback on my presentation.